He fired her on a Tuesday, didn't even look up from his mahogany desk. To Damien Russo, Hazel was just a quiet girl who typed fast and brought his coffee. Disposable. A week later, staring at a frozen frame of recovered security footage, the oxygen violently left his lungs. He watched his plain, mousy secretary calmly dismantle a man twice her size, sliding a suppressed pistol into her purse before walking in to hand him his termination letter. The Underworld doesn't operate in dark alleys anymore. It operates in boardrooms with floor-to-ceiling windows, filtered air, and men wearing $6,000 suits. Damien Russo owned the 72nd floor of the Apex building, and from up there, Chicago looked like a circuit board of lights and wealth. He controlled the ports. He controlled the unions. He controlled the blood flow of the city, and it was slowly grinding him into dust. Damien rubbed his temples, feeling the dull, persistent throb behind his eyes. Paranoia was a heavy coat, and he wore it every hour of the day. Every handshake was a potential threat. Every smile was a calculation. In a life composed entirely of loud egos, violent tempers, and constant friction, the only frictionless surface was the desk of his executive assistant, Hazel Brooks. If you asked Damien to describe her, he would have struggled. She was 20-something, maybe 30. She wore beige cardigans that swallowed her shape, sensible black flats that made absolutely no noise on the hardwood floors, and skirts that hit exactly 2 inches below the knee. Her hair was a non-committal shade of brown, usually pulled back into a clip. She didn't wear perfume. She didn't wear makeup aside from perhaps a swipe of pale lip balm. She was a ghost who possessed a 200-word-per-minute typing speed and an uncanny ability to know exactly when he needed a glass of water, a double espresso, or an alibi. Damien liked her because he didn't have to think about her. In his world, women were either leverage liabilities or loud. Hazel was none of the above. She was a machine. You put a task into the slot, and perfectly formatted results came out. Until the Tuesday with Bastian. Bastian Locke was a problem. He ran the narcotics trade on the South Side, a younger, hungrier breed of criminal who didn't respect the old boundaries. Damien had summoned him to the Apex building to sign a territorial agreement. It was a show of dominance. Coming to Damien's office meant acknowledging Damien's throne. The atmosphere in the boardroom was thick enough to choke on. Bastian slouched in his leather chair, flanked by 2 men whose suits couldn't hide the bulk of their shoulder holsters. Damien sat at the head of the table, his own head of security, Garrett standing rigid by the door. "It's a simple arrangement, Bastian Damien," said his voice, a low, gravelly baritone that commanded the room. "You keep your product out of my shipping containers. I let you use my warehouses for storage at a 30% premium. Everyone makes money. Nobody bleeds." Bastian picked at his fingernails with a gold toothpick. 30% is steep, Russo. My guys are doing the heavy lifting. Your guys are using my infrastructure, Damien countered smoothly. The infrastructure I built while you were still stealing stereos out of Honda Civics. Bastian's jaw tightened. The insult landed perfectly. Damien pressed the advantage. He hit the intercom button embedded in the table. "Hazel, bring in the lock contracts. 3 copies. Silence. Damien frowned. He tapped the button again. "Hazel." Only the faint hiss of static replied. Bastian smirked, sitting up slightly. "Trouble with the help, Damien? If you can't even keep a secretary in line, how are you going to keep the South Side in checks?" A hot spike of irritation pierced Damien's skull. Hazel was never away from her desk. Never. She didn't take lunch breaks. She ate almonds out of a desk drawer. She didn't take bathroom breaks that lasted longer than 90 seconds. Her absence now in front of a rival he was trying to humiliate was a glaring crack in his armor. 5 minutes passed. The tension in the room morphed from aggressive to awkward. Damien's authority was hemorrhaging with every tick of the war clock. He was forced to make small talk, forced to pour Bastian a glass of scotch he didn't deserve, forced to pretend he wasn't seething. 22 minutes later, the heavy oak door clicked open. Hazel walked in. She carried 3 leather-bound folders. Damien's eyes locked onto her, cold and lethal. But if he expected an apology, he didn't get one. She didn't look flustered. She walked with her usual silent, measured pace. But as she approached the table, Damien's sharp eyes caught the details. Her beige cardigan was missing a button. Her chest was rising and falling, just a fraction faster than normal. And there was a faint, metallic smell clinging to her, a smell that completely overpowered her usual scent of nothingness. It smelled like copper, like burnt dust, like blood. "Apologies for the delay, Mr. Russo," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of tremor. She distributed the folders, one to Bastian, one to his lawyer, one to Damien. Bastian chuckled, flipping his open. "Where were you, sweetheart?" "Getting a manicure." Hazel didn't look at him. She didn't even acknowledge he had spoken. She simply stepped back and folded her hands in front of her. "Will there be anything else, sir?" Damien glared at her. The humiliation was a sour taste in his mouth. "No, get out." She nodded once and slipped out the door. Bastian signed the contract, but the victory felt hollow. The dominance had been undercut by a 22-minute delay. When Bastian left, grinning like he had won something, Damien remained at the table. He stared at the signature on the paper. He didn't tolerate incompetence. In his line of work, a missed detail was a bullet in the dark. If his secretary couldn't be relied upon to deliver a piece of paper on time, she couldn't be relied upon at all. He stood up, adjusting his cuffs. The decision was made. Cold, calculated, final. The rain had started a hard-driving Chicago downpour that slashed against the floor-to-ceiling glass of Damien's private office. He stood by the window, watching the grey city blur beneath him, a glass of amber liquid held loosely in his right hand. The door clicked. Hazel entered. "You asked to see me, Mr. Russo." He didn't turn around immediately. He took a sip of his scotch, letting the burn slide down his throat. Then he pivoted. She stood in the center of the vast room, looking small. Her hands were clasped in front of her. The missing button on her cardigan was still a glaring flaw in her usually immaculate, if boring, presentation. 22 minutes, Hazel Damien said. His voice wasn't raised. It was a dangerous, quiet thing. "Yes, sir. Bastian Locker is a hyena. He looks for weakness. He looks for a limp. Today you gave him one. You made me look like a man who doesn't have a grip on his own outer office. I apologize, Mr. Russo. I was delayed." Delayed. Damien scoffed, walking slowly toward his desk. He leaned against the heavy wood, crossing his arms. "Did the printer jam? Did you drop your pen? What monumental crisis kept you from opening a door for 22 minutes? Hazel looked at him. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out hazelnut. For the first time in 3 years of employment, Damien actually looked at them. They were entirely empty. There was no fear, no panic, not even the usual nervous flutter of an employee facing the boss. "An unforeseen logistical issue, sir," she said evenly. Damien let out a short, harsh laugh. "A logistical issue? Right. Well, here's a logistical solution." He reached into his drawer and pulled out a thick white envelope. He tossed it onto the desk. It landed with a heavy, flat thud. 2-month severance. Cash. Clear your desk. Leave the batch. He expected tears. He expected a plea. Most people, when faced with the sudden, violent termination of their livelihood, especially a livelihood that paid as well as he did, broke down. They begged. They promised it would never happen again. Hazel Brooks did none of that. She looked at the envelope. Then she looked back up at Damien. "Understood, Mr. Russo." She stepped forward, picked up the envelope and turned around. She walked out of his office with the exact same measured, silent stride she had used to enter it. The door clicked shut behind her. Damien stood there in the silence. A strange, crawling sensation prickled at the back of his neck. An itch, a sudden, inexplicable drop in the room's atmospheric pressure. He shook it off, attributing it to the stress of the lock meeting, and went back to his window. Out in the bullpen, Hazel walked to her desk. She didn't look angry. She didn't look sad. She opened her bottom drawer and pulled out a single flattened cardboard box. She assembled it with quick, efficient folds. She placed a plain black coffee mug inside, a pair of spare reading glasses, a lint roller. She didn't have any photographs, no pictures of a boyfriend, a dog, a family vacation. Her desk was as barren as a hospital room. She opened the top drawer and took out her security badge. She stared at it for a fraction of a second, her thumb grazing the plastic edge. Then she placed it precisely in the center of her keyboard. Garrett, the head of security, walked by. A massive, scarred man who had survived 2 wars and a stint in a cartel prison. He stopped looking at the box. "You moving desks, Hazel?" he grunted. "No, Garrett," she replied softly. "I'm moving on." Garrett frowned, his thick brow furrowing. He looked toward Damien's closed door, then back at her. "He fired you. He terminated my employment, yes," Christ, Garrett muttered. Over the delay with Bastion, Hazel picked up her box. "It was a pleasure working with you, Garrett. Make sure Mr. Russo drinks his chamomile tea on Thursdays. It helps with his blood pressure. And tell the night shift to keep a closer eye on the loading dock cameras. They've been drifting 3 degrees to the left every night at 2 a.m. Garrett stared at her, genuinely surprised. "How do you know about the camera drift?" Hazel gave him a small, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I notice things." "Goodbye, Garrett." She walked out the glass double doors, stepping into the elevator. The doors slid shut, severing Hazel Brooks from the underworld she had silently inhabited for 3 years. By Thursday, the absence of Hazel Brooks was an open wound in the office. Damien had ordered HR to send up a replacement immediately. They sent a girl named Brittany. Brittany wore strong perfume that smelled like artificial peaches. She typed at 90 words a minute, and the clatter of her acrylic nails on the keyboard sounded like a hailstorm. She brought him his coffee, black, forgetting the splash of oat milk. She let calls through from numbers he didn't recognize. But it wasn't just the noise and the incompetence that bothered Damien. It was a deeper, more primal unease. When Hazel was there, the office felt impenetrable. The files were exactly where they needed to be. The schedule flowed with martial precision. Now things felt loose, exposed. Damien found himself staring at her empty desk through the glass walls of his office. He felt a nagging sense of having amputated a healthy limb. On Friday evening, after Brittany had practically sprinted out the door at 5 p.m., Damien walked out to Hazel's old desk. He didn't know what he was looking for. He ran a hand over the cold laminate surface. He pulled open the drawers. Empty, spotless. He pulled the bottom right drawer. It wouldn't budge. Locked. Damien frowned. Hazel had left her keys with HR. He walked back into his office, grabbed a heavy steel letter opener, and returned to the desk. With a brute force shove, he wedged the steel into the gap and cracked the lock mechanism. Wood splintered. The drawer slid open. Inside there were no stolen office supplies, no hidden snacks. There was a single black leather notebook. Damien picked it up. It was heavy, filled with high-quality grid paper. He flipped it open. The handwriting was tiny, precise, and entirely devoid of loops or flourishes. It looked like the code of a machine. October 12th, Bastion Locke's Lieutenant Mouse spotted at a diner 3 blocks from Apex. Meeting with unknown associate. October 14th, catering company for board meetings switched vendors at the last minute. New vendor is Silver Spoon. Registered owner has ties to the Genovese family. Flagged for review, Damien's breath hitched. He flipped a page. November 2nd, black SUV plates, XYZ, 119 parked idle across from parking garage entrance for 4 hours. Driver smoking constantly. Called in anonymous tip for loitering/suspicious vehicle to local precinct. Car moved at 4:15 p.m. Damien remembered that day. He had been walking to his car at 4:20 p.m. He flipped page after page. Dozens of entries, hundreds of them. License plates, names, observations on security floors, schedules of rival bosses. She hadn't just been bringing him coffee. She had been running a one-woman counterintelligence operation from a desk in the bullpen without a single person noticing. A cold sweat broke out on Damien's palms. He slammed the book shut just as the elevator pinged. Garrett stepped out, moving faster than a man his size usually did. His face was pale beneath his heavy tan. He was holding a secure tablet in his large hands. Boss Garrett said, his voice tight. "You need to come down to the security room. Right now." "What is it?" Damien snapped, his nerves already frayed by the notebook. "Is it Bastian?" "No," Garrett said, swallowing hard. "It's about Tuesday, the day you fired Hazel. Our tech guys were trying to fix the blind spots on the 71st floor service corridors. The data drive for camera 4 had corrupted, but they just managed to rebuild the file from the cloud backup. And Garrett said, looking physically sick, "You need to see why Hazel was 22 minutes late." The security room in the basement of the Apex building was a sensory deprivation chamber compared to the glass tower above. It was dark, humming with the sound of cooling fans from the server racks, lit only by the bluish glow of a dozen high-definition monitors. Damien walked in the leather notebook, still gripped tightly in his hand. Garrett pulled out a rolling chair for him in front of the central console. The tech guy, a young kid with bags under his eyes, shrank back into his hoodie as Damien approached. "Play it," Damien ordered. The kid clicked his mouse. The center screen maximized a piece of grainy, gray-toned footage. The timestamp in the corner read, Tuesday 2:14 p.m. Exactly 8 minutes before Damien had hit the intercom for the contracts. The camera angle looked down an L-shaped intersection of a service corridor right outside the catering kitchen on the 71st floor. It was a desolate stretch, used only for moving garbage and supplies. On the screen, Hazel walked into the frame. She was carrying the 3 leather folders. Her stride was unbroken calm. She was heading toward the stairwell to bring them up to 72. Suddenly a man stepped out from the catering alcove, blocking her path. He was wearing a white chef's coat, but he was massive. 250 pounds of pure muscle with a thick neck and a bald head. Damien didn't recognize him, but he recognized the type. Eastern European muscle. A freelancer. A killer. Damien leaned closer to the monitor. The silence in the room was absolute. On the screen, the man reached into his coat and pulled out a suppressed pistol. He aimed it directly at Hazel's chest. The man spoke, there was no audio, but his lips moved in a sneer. He was demanding something. He gestured toward the stairwell leading up to Damien's office. He wanted her keycard. He wanted access. "Watch her hands," Garrett whispered roughly. Damien watched. Hazel didn't drop the folders. She didn't scream. She didn't put her hands up. She shifted her weight. In a movement so fast, the camera frame rate blurred it into a smear of beige. Hazel acted. She didn't retreat. She stepped into the gun. Her left hand shot out, not to grab the barrel, but to slam the web of her hand against the slide of the pistol, pushing it out of battery so it couldn't fire. Simultaneously, her right hand, still holding the heavy leather folders, cracked upward in a vicious, sweeping arc. The spine of the folders smashed into the man's throat. The assassin staggered back, his eyes bulging as his windpipe crushed. The gun dropped to the floor. Hazel didn't pause. She dropped the folders. She stepped forward, grabbed the lapels of his chef's coat, and executed a flawless, brutal leg sweep. The massive man crashed to the linoleum floor with a force that seemed to shake the silent camera. Before he could recover, Hazel was on him. She dropped her knee directly onto his sternum. Her right hand darted into the pocket of her sensible cardigan. She pulled out a small metallic cylinder. A syringe. She slammed it into the side of the man's thick neck, depressing the plunger with her thumb. The assassin thrashed for exactly 4 seconds. Then his eyes rolled back, and he went entirely limp. Damien couldn't breathe. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. On the screen, Hazel stood up. She smoothed her skirt. She bent down, picked up the suppressed pistol, checked the chamber with a practiced flick of her wrist, and slid it into her plain leather purse. Then she grabbed the man by the collar. With shocking leverage and strength, she dragged his 250-pound dead weight across the floor, hauling him into a janitorial closet and shutting the door. She walked back to where she had dropped the folders. She picked them up. She looked down at her cardigan, noticing the missing button that must have popped off during the grapple. She adjusted the fabric to hide it as best she could. She took a deep, centering breath, her chest rising and falling. Then she turned and walked toward the stairwell. The timestamp read 2:36 p.m. The screen went black. The basement server room felt like a tomb. Damien stared at his reflection in the dead monitor. He was a hitter boss. Garrett said, his voice breaking the heavy silence. Interpol read notice. Name is Kovich. Specializes in close-quarters assassinations. We found him in the closet 4 hours later, still comatose. We thought one of Bastion's guys got cold feet and drugged him to cover their tracks. We never looked at Hazel. Damien slowly looked down at his hands. He fired her. He fired a woman who had just engaged in hand-to-hand combat with a professional killer, neutralized him, hid the body, and still managed to deliver the contracts to his desk. He had yelled at her for a 22-minute delay, a delay spent saving his life. Why didn't she say anything? Damien rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Why didn't she tell me there was a hitman in the building? Garrett shook his head slowly. I don't know. But, boss, there's more. Damien snapped his head up. More. Garrett reached over the tech kid's shoulder and tapped the keyboard. A new video file loaded. When we saw this, I had the boys run a full retroactive audit on Hazel's movements, cross-referenced with every near miss we've had in the last year. Garrett paused, swallowing hard. You remember the brake failure on your SUV last November? Damien stiffened. It wasn't a brake failure. The line was cut. We just couldn't prove who did it or how they got into my private garage at my condo. Watch, Garrett said. The screen flickered to life. It was a feed from a traffic cam across the street from Damien's luxury high-rise. Timestamp November 14th, 3 a.m. A shadowy figure dressed entirely in black was working under Damien's armored SUV, which was parked just inside the open security gate. The figure was moving efficiently. Then from the left side of the screen, another figure approached. She was wearing a long, sensible raincoat and carrying an umbrella, though it wasn't raining. The figure under the car rolled out, startled, pulling a blade. The woman in the raincoat didn't flinch. She swung the umbrella, but she didn't hit him with it. She pressed a button on the handle. A flash of bright, blinding light, a strobe or a taser erupted from the tip. The man, blinded, stumbled back. The woman stepped in, delivering a sharp, precise strike to the man's knee. It snapped backward with a sickening, visible jolt. The man collapsed. The woman stood over him, said something that made him freeze in absolute terror, and then pointed down the street. The man scrambled away on his hands, and one good leg fleeing into the night. The woman turned toward the camera for a fraction of a second before popping the umbrella open to shield her face, but it was enough. The pale face, the sensible raincoat. Hazel Brooks. She knelt by the car, inspected the cut brake line, and then pulled a roll of industrial vulcanized tape from her pocket. She patched the line, bleeding the valve with a small wrench, securing it just enough so the car would survive the drive to the mechanic the next morning. masking the assassination attempt as a simple mechanical failure. She finished the job, stood up, dusted off her raincoat, and walked away into the dark. Damien felt the floor drop out from under him. The notebook in his hand felt like a block of lead. She had saved him. Not once, but twice. And she had done it in absolute secrecy, asking for no credit, no hazard pay, no gratitude. She had bled for him in the shadows and served him coffee in the light, and he had thrown her out onto the street like trash because she had bruised his ego in front of a rival. "Find her," Damien commanded. His voice wasn't gravelly anymore. It was jagged glass. He stood up so fast his chair crashed backward onto the floor. Garrett flinched. "Boss, we tried. When I saw the first video, I sent a team to her apartment on file. It's empty, stripped bare. Landlord says she broke the lease yesterday, paid in cash, left no forwarding address. I don't care if she moved to the moon." Garrett, Damien roared, the suppressed emotion of the last 20 minutes finally detonating. "Tear this city apart. Check the train stations, the airports, the bus terminals. Call in every favor we have with the feds. Hack the traffic grids. Find the invisible woman." He stormed out of the server room, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind him, leaving a ringing silence in his wake. Damien Russo, the untouchable king of Chicago, had just realized he wasn't standing on a throne. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, and he had just fired his only parachute. For 72 hours, Damien Russo did not sleep. His office, usually a sanctuary of controlled power, had transformed into a war room. The mahogany desk was buried under stacks of paper background checks, financial records, HR files. Garrett stood by the window, his massive frame tight with exhaustion, holding a phone to his ear. "Nothing," Garrett said, lowering the device. His voice was a rasp of frustration. Facial recognition at O'Hare Midway Union Station. Nothing. We pulled the security feeds from the streets around her apartment. She walked out the front door at 6 a.m. on Wednesday, carrying a single duffel bag, turned down an alley on 4th Street, and vanished. No car picked her up. She didn't take the L train. She just stepped into the concrete and disappeared. Damien stared at the black leather notebook resting in the center of his desk. It was the only clean thing in the room. "What about the background check?" Damien asked, his eyes locked on the grid paper. "Fake," Garrett replied, dropping a thin file onto the pile. "All of it. Hazel Brooks doesn't exist. The social security number belongs to a girl who died of leukemia in Seattle 20 years ago. The references she provided when HR hired her burner phones that have been dead for 2 years. The college degree is a high-grade forgery. She's a ghost boss, a highly trained, deeply embedded ghost." Damien rubbed his jaw. The stubble felt like sandpaper. The paranoia that usually sat on his shoulders like a heavy coat had mutated into something sharper. It was vertigo. He had built his empire on the belief that he saw everything controlled, everything. Yet for 3 years, a woman capable of snapping a professional killer's neck had been organizing his calendar and pouring his coffee. "Why, Garrett," Damien muttered, flipping the notebook open. If she was planted by a rival, she had 1,000 chances to put a bullet in my head. She poured my drinks. She booked my flights. But she didn't kill me. She kept me alive. "Maybe she's a Fed," Garrett suggested, though he sounded unconvinced. "Building a RICO case. Feds don't drug hitmen and drag them into janitorial closets," Damien snapped. "Feds don't cripple mechanics in the dead of night and patch brake lines." She wasn't building a case. She was playing defense. Damien turned a page in the notebook. He ran his thumb over the tiny, precise handwriting. It was entirely devoid of emotion. Pure data. He stopped on the last page with text dated the Monday before he fired her. November 14th. Bastion Lock, expanding operations near the docks. Weakness identified in Apex exterior security rotation. South Alley camera blind spot remains unpatched. Requisitioned new locks for lower-level access doors. Vendor Miller Hardware, invoice number 4409. Damien frowned. He tapped the page. Garrett. She handled my personal schedule. Why was she requisitioning hardware for the lower levels? That's your department. Garrett leaned over, squinting at the page. She didn't. I handle all physical security upgrades. I never authorized an order from a Miller Hardware. I use industrial suppliers, not local shops. Damien felt a sudden sharp clarity pierce through his exhaustion. Get me the address for Miller Hardware. It was a small, dusty shop on the industrial edge of the city, wedged between a defunct tire factory and a rusted train overpass. Damien didn't send a team. He took Garrett, and he took his armored SUV. He needed to do this himself. The air outside was thick with the threat of rain, the sky a bruised purple. The bell above the hardware store door jingled pathetically as Damien walked in. The air smelled of motor oil and sawdust. An older man was behind the counter reading a newspaper. "Can I help you?" the man asked, looking up at Damien's $6,000 suit with deep suspicion. Damien placed a $100 bill on the glass counter. "I'm looking for an invoice. Number 4409, from earlier this week." The man looked at the money, then at Garrett's imposing bulk lingering by the door. He didn't argue. He typed slowly into a prehistoric computer terminal. "Yeah," the man said. "Order went out Tuesday morning. Paid in cash." "What was it?" Damien asked. "2 heavy-duty deadbolts, a reinforced steel strike plate, and a gallon of industrial bleach." Damien's stomach tightened. "Bleach? Where was it delivered?" "Wasn't delivered," the man said. "Customer picked it up. Plain-looking woman, brown hair, paid exact change." "Did she say where she was going?" The man snorted. "Buddy, she barely said 3 words, but she asked if I knew a place that sold prepaid generator fuel in bulk. I pointed her to a supply yard about 5 miles down the highway. Route 9, old shipping container yard." Damien slid another 100 across the counter. "Thank you." He walked out to the SUV, the gravel crunching under his leather shoes. He knew what Hazel was doing. She wasn't just hiding. She was fortifying. Route 9 was a desolate stretch of cracked asphalt that led away from the city's neon glow. The shipping container yard was a graveyard of rusted corrugated steel stacked 3 high in labyrinthine rows. The floodlights were mostly dead, casting long, jagged shadows across the muddy ground. Damien cut the headlights of the SUV a mile out. He drove by the pale light of the moon, navigating the heavy vehicle through the rusted gates. "Keep your eyes open," Damien murmured, drawing a sleek semi-automatic from his shoulder holster. He checked the chamber. A metallic clack echoed in the quiet cab. Garrett had a short-barreled rifle resting across his lap. "This is a bad place for a conversation, boss. Lots of blind corners." "She chose it for a reason," Damien replied. He parked the SUV behind a stack of green Maersk containers, shielding it from the main road. They got out their boots, sinking slightly into the damp earth. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the highway. Damien moved methodically down the narrow aisle between the metal boxes. He was looking for signs of life, a fresh tire track, a hum of a generator. He checked the padlock on a blue container to his left. Rusted solid. They walked deeper into the maze. Then Damien saw it. Tucked into a dead-end alcove was a single, faded grey container. Unlike the others, the heavy steel doors were slightly ajar. A faint, low hum vibrated from within a portable generator. And on the heavy iron latch, shining dull silver in the gloom, was a brand-new heavy-duty deadbolt, currently unengaged. Damien raised his hand, signaling Garrett to stop. He moved forward, his gun raised his heart, drumming a steady, heavy beat against his ribs. He reached out his fingertips, brushing the cold steel of the door. He was about to pull it open when the sound of shattering glass tore through the night. It didn't come from the container. It came from behind them. Damien spun around. At the entrance of their aisle, 3 black SUVs had silently rolled into position, blocking their exit. The headlights flared to life, blindingly bright, trapping Damien and Garrett in a harsh, inescapable wash of white light. "Contact," Garrett roared, bringing his rifle up. But the enemy was already firing. The staccato bark of automatic weapons shattered the silence. Bullets sparked against the steel containers, shrieking as they ricocheted. Damien dove to the dirt, rolling behind the lip of a rusted red container. Gravel sprayed his face as a line of heavy-caliber rounds chewed up the ground where he had just been standing. How many? Damien yelled over the deafening noise. "At least a dozen," Garrett shouted back, pinned down on the opposite side of the aisle. "They tracked us, Bastion's guys." Damien cursed viciously. Bastion lock. The hyena had smelled the blood in the water. He knew Damien was out of his fortress, driving through the outskirts of the city. He had waited for the perfect moment to strike. Damien leaned around the corner, squeezing off 3 rapid shots into the glare of the headlights. A man screamed, a shadow crumbling into the dirt. But the returning fire was overwhelming. Sparks rained down on Damien as the metal above his head was chewed into jagged shrapnel. "We need to move!" Garrett yelled, firing a controlled burst that shattered a headlight, plunging part of the aisle back into darkness, where we're boxed in. Damien fired again, the slide of his gun locking back. Empty. He smoothly ejected the magazine and slammed a fresh one home. Footsteps crunched on the gravel. Bastion's men were advancing, using the containers for cover, moving in a tactical formation. They weren't street thugs. These were paid professionals. Bastion had emptied his war chest for this hit. A heavy, sickening thud echoed from Garrett's position. "Garrett," Damien yelled. "I'm hit," Garrett grunted, his voice tight with agony. "Left leg. I can't put weight on it." Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced Damien's chest. He was going to die here, in the mud among rusted metal, because he was too arrogant to see the shield that had been protecting him. He raised his gun, preparing to step out and draw their fire to give Garrett a few more seconds of life. Suddenly the floodlight atop the nearest SUV exploded in a shower of sparks. The gunfire from the advancing hit squad abruptly stopped, replaced by a confused shout. Damien blinked, trying to clear the spots from his vision. In the sudden dimness, he saw a shadow drop from the top of the 3-story container stack, directly above the advancing men. It was utterly silent. No battle cry, no cinematic landing. The shadow simply fell into the center of the kill squad. Before the men could react, the shadow moved. A swift, brutal strike to the throat of the lead gunman. He crumpled instantly, his rifle clattering to the dirt. The man next to him spun around, raising his weapon. The shadow grabbed the barrel of the rifle, redirecting it upward as it fired a burst into the empty sky, and simultaneously drove a knee into the man's groin. As he doubled over, the shadow brought an elbow down onto the back of his neck with a sickening crack. "What the hell is that?" one of Bastion's men screamed, backing away. The shadow didn't answer. It moved with fluid, horrifying efficiency. It was a blur of calculated violence, aiming for joints, throats, and nerves. A garrote wire caught the ambient moonlight for a fraction of a second before it whipped around a third man's neck, pulling him backward into the darkness between 2 containers. Damien watched, mesmerized and horrified. It took less than 40 seconds. 4 men were dead or unconscious on the ground. The remaining gunmen at the SUVs began to panic, firing wildly into the shadows. A suppressed gunshot, a quiet thud, sounded from the darkness. The driver of the lead SUV slumped against the steering wheel, the horn blaring a continuous droning wail. The surviving hitmen broke. They scrambled into the remaining 2 SUVs' tires, spinning in the mud as they threw the vehicles into reverse, tearing out of the container yard and disappearing into the night. The horn of the idling SUV wailed into the sudden echoing silence. Damien slowly stood up, keeping his gun raised. His breathing was ragged. From the deep shadows between the metal boxes, A figure stepped out. She was wearing dark cargo pants, a black turtleneck and heavy tactical boots. Her brown hair was tied back in a tight, practical knot. Her face was smudged with dirt and a streak of grease, but her eyes were exactly the same. Pale, empty, calculating. She held a suppressed pistol by her side, her finger safely off the trigger. Hazel Brooks looked at the carnage around her, then looked at Damien. "You're loud, Mr. Russo," she said, her voice, the familiar flat tone that usually informed him his 2 p.m. meeting was delayed. "And you're compromising my exit protocol." The wailing car horn was a drill into Damien's skull. Hazel walked calmly to the idling SUV, opened the driver's side door, shoved the dead man's foot off the pedal, and reached in to rip the wire cluster out of the steering column. The horn died. The silence that followed was heavy, ringing with the aftermath of violence. Hazel walked back toward Damien. She didn't look breathless. She bent down, gracefully checked the pulse of one of Bastion's men, then efficiently stripped his spare magazines, slipping them into her cargo pockets. Damien holstered his weapon. He felt stripped bare. The $1,000 suit was ruined, covered in mud and oil. His authority, his untouchable aura, it was all stripped away, leaving only the man underneath. "You're bleeding," Hazel said, not looking at him, as she secured a combat knife from another fallen man. Damien touched his cheek. A piece of shrapnel had sliced a shallow cut across his cheekbone. He hadn't felt it. "Garrett's hit," he said, his voice grating in his throat. Hazel finally looked up. She walked quickly to where Garrett was leaning against the rusted metal, his hands clamped over a bloody hole in his thigh. "Move your hands, Garrett," she ordered. Garrett, a man who took orders from absolutely no one except Damien, obeyed instantly. Hazel knelt, pulled a tactical tourniquet from a small pouch on her belt, and cinched it high on his leg with brutal, practiced force. Garrett grunted, his jaw tight. "It's a clean, through and through," Hazel analyzed flatly. "Missed the artery. You'll live. But you need antibiotics and a stitch." She stood up, wiping blood from her hands onto her dark pants. She turned to face Damien. They stood 3 feet apart in the muddy aisle. The gap between them felt like an ocean. "How did you find me?" she asked. "The hardware store," Damien said. "The invoice in the notebook." Hazel's eyes flickered, a microscopic break in her armor. A lapse in protocol. "I shouldn't have left it locked. I assumed you wouldn't break company property." "Company property," Damien repeated, a bitter, breathless laugh escaping him. "You killed a man with a binder in my hallway, Hazel. You crippled an assassin under my car, and you sat outside my office taking notes on my schedule. Who the hell are you?" "My name is Hazel Brooks," she said calmly. "Don't lie to me." "Not anymore." Damien stepped closer. He wasn't intimidating her, and he knew it. He just needed to see her eyes in the dim light. "Garrett ran your ghost file. You don't exist. So tell me, who sent you? Was it the Colombians, the commission who paid you to sit in a beige sweater for 3 years and keep me breathing?" Hazel looked at him for a long, silent moment. The cold wind whipped through the container yard, rattling the loose corrugated steel. "Nobody sent me, Mr. Russo." Damien frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I am an independent contractor," Hazel said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, shedding the polite secretary persona completely. It sounded metallic, dangerous. "My previous employer was a private intelligence firm, high-risk asset protection. But I retired 4 years ago. Then why were you in my office?" Hazel sighed, a small, barely perceptible release of breath. "Because of your father." Damien froze. The mention of his father, the ruthless patriarch who had built the Russo syndicate and died of a sudden stroke 5 years ago, hit him like a physical blow. "My father, Antonio Russo, was not a good man," Hazel said plainly. "But he was a pragmatist. 6 years ago, when I was still active, an operation went catastrophically wrong in Prague. I was burned, disavowed, hunted by my own agency. I was bleeding out in an alley when your father's men found me. He was there finalizing a shipping route. He didn't know who I was, but he recognized a trained asset. He smuggled me out of the country in a crate of imported engine parts. He paid for a private surgeon. He gave me a new identity. Damien stared at her. His father had never mentioned this, never breathed a word of a rogue operative saved in Prague. He didn't ask for a life debt. Hazel continued, her eyes drifting toward the rusted skyline. He told me to disappear, to live a quiet life. I tried, I really did. She looked down at her hands, the knuckles bruised and split. But peace is loud. It didn't suit me. She looked back up at Damien. When your father died, I read the reports. I knew the power vacuum it would create. I knew the wolves would come for you. You were smart, Damien. But you were loud. You operated in the light, relying on fear. Fear is a fragile shield. I knew you wouldn't survive the transition. So you forged a resume and applied for a job in HR. Damien said, the realization settling heavily in his gut. I put myself in the most strategically advantageous position to monitor threats to your person, Hazel corrected. The executive assistant controls the flow of information. I controlled your schedule, your access points, and your food supply. I intercepted 9 credible threats in 3 years. Kovic was the 10th. Damien felt the earth tilt. 9. 9 times he had walked past the edge of the abyss, and she had silently pulled him back by the collar, asking for nothing. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice cracking. After the first time, I would have paid you a fortune. I would have put you in charge of all security. Because you wouldn't have trusted me, Hazel said bluntly. In your world, loyalty is bought. If you knew what I was capable of, you would have treated me as a weapon. And weapons are eventually pointed at the person holding them. By staying invisible, I remained effective. You didn't have to trust me, because you didn't even notice me. The truth of her words stung sharper than the cut on his face. She was right. If he had known she was a killer, he would have spent every day wondering when she would turn on him. He had trusted her precisely because he thought she was weak. And then I fired you, Damien said softly. You terminated my employment, Hazel corrected again, which released me from my self-imposed obligation. The debt to your father was paid. I packed my desk. I was leaving the city tonight. Damien looked at the carnage around them. Bastion's dead men. Garrett bleeding on the ground. He looked at Hazel, the invisible woman who had held his empire together with binder clips and violence. He didn't want a weapon. He didn't want a secretary. He reached into his ruined suit jacket. His hand brushed past his empty holster. He pulled out the thick, white envelope. The severance pay. It was creased and slightly damp from the rain. He held it out to her. Hazel looked at the envelope. She didn't take it. I don't need your money, Mr. Russo. It's not money, Damien said. Hazel hesitated, then took the envelope. She tore the seal. Inside there was no cash. There was only the black leather notebook. Bastion Locke knows I'm bleeding, Damien said, his voice hardening, finding its gravelly edge once more. He's going to make a run at the Apex building by morning. I have 50 men who can shoot, but they shoot loud. I don't need loud right now, Hazel. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. I need a ghost. Hazel looked down at the notebook in her hands. Her thumb traced the edge of the leather binding. Slowly she looked up, her pale eyes meeting his. For the first time in 3 years, the faintest ghost of a smile touched the corner of her mouth. Standard consulting fees apply, Mr. Russo, she said, and I don't fetch coffee anymore. Damien nodded slowly. Deal. Hazel drove the bullet-scarred SUV. She didn't grip the wheel with the white-knuckled panic of a civilian. Her hands rested lightly at 9, and 3, her posture relaxed, her eyes scanning the dark ribbon of the highway. Beside her, Damien sat in the passenger seat, loading fresh magazines from the tactical reserve in the glove box. In the back, Garrett was a massive groaning shadow, his leg elevated and tightly bound. The radio was off. The only sound was the hum of the tires and the harsh rattle of the ruined bodywork fighting the wind. "Bastian won't wait for morning," Damien said, breaking the silence. The metallic snap of a bullet sliding into a magazine punctuated his words. He sent his best hitters to the yard. When they don't check in, he'll know it went wrong. He'll mobilize. He'll hit the Apex building, tear up the Southside docks, and burn everything that has my name on it to force me out into the open. "Then we don't let him realize it went wrong," Hazel replied. She didn't look at him. She checked the rearview mirror. "We go to him." Damien paused, a half-loaded magazine in his hand. "He operates out of a fortified import garage on the river. Steel doors blast windows, 20 armed men on the floor at any given time. I have a bleeding head of security and 1 ghost. It's a suicide run." "It's a suicide run if you knock on the front door," Hazel corrected smoothly. She downshifted the SUV, growling, as she took an exit ramp that curved back toward the industrial belly of Chicago. Bastian's security is designed to repel a siege, a rival family rolling up in a motorcade. He relies on cameras, floodlights, and heavy-caliber weapons. He relies on his enemies being exactly like you. Loud Damien muttered the word, tasting like ash. "Yes." Hazel turned the wheel sharply, navigating into a labyrinth of narrow, unlit service roads that ran parallel to the river. But a fortress is only as strong as its weakest seam. The import garage is a retrofitted meat-packing plant. Built in the 20s, the ventilation shafts bypass the exterior steel doors entirely. They're narrow. A man with a rifle can't fit through them. Damien looked at her. Her beige cardigan was gone, abandoned somewhere in her apartment. In the dark, tactical gear with the grease on her face and the cold calculation in her eyes, she was a stranger. And yet she was exactly the same woman who had organized his life with ruthless, silent efficiency for 3 years. She hadn't changed. He just finally had the eyes to see her. "You can fit," Damien said. "I can," she agreed. "I breach the ventilation. I drop into the main breaker room. I cut the hard lines and the backup generators. The building goes dark. Bastian's men are thugs, Mr. Russo. In the dark, thugs panic. They lose discipline. They shoot at shadows. And what do I do?" Hazel finally turned to look at him. The pale, washed-out hazelnut of her eyes caught the distant glow of the city skyline. "You become the shadow. You walk through the front door." Damien felt a slow, dangerous smile pull at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't the arrogant smile of a mob boss. It was the feral grin of a man who realized he wasn't trapped in a cage with a predator. He was hunting with one. They parked 2 blocks from the garage, hiding the battered SUV beneath the rusted arches of a train bridge. Garrett stayed behind a loaded shotgun, resting across his good leg. He didn't argue. He knew his limits, and he knew a liability when he saw one. 10 minutes, Hazel said, checking a heavy diver's watch on her wrist. "Give me 10 minutes to clear the duct and reach the breaker. When the lights go out, the magnetic locks on the front doors will disengage. That is your entry window. Do not advance until they are completely blind." "Understood," Damien said. He watched her step out into the freezing rain. Before she could vanish into the darkness, Damien grabbed her wrist. She stopped. Her muscles coiled instantly, a reflex born of violence. But she didn't pull away. She looked down at his hand, then up at his face. "Hazel." His voice was low, stripped of all its boardroom command. "Don't die in the dark." She studied him for a second. The machine-like facade slipped just a millimeter, revealing the beating human heart beneath the armor. I don't intend to. I haven't billed you for my hours yet. She slipped her wrist from his grip and melted into the shadows. She didn't walk away. She simply ceased to be visible. Damien stood in the freezing rain, counting the seconds. The import garage was a brutalist block of concrete and steel sitting on the edge of the Black River. Heavy halogen floodlights bathed the perimeter in an aggressive, unforgiving glare. Inside, Bastian Locke was drinking. Through the reinforced glass of his second-story office, Bastian watched his men down on the garage floor. They were playing cards on the hoods of stolen luxury cars, their rifles resting on crates of contraband. Bastian checked his phone for the 10th time. Nothing. His kill squad should have called in by now. The silence was beginning to gnaw at the edges of his confidence. He poured another glass of scotch. He was the new king. Damien Rousseau was a relic, a man who pushed papers while Bastian pushed boundaries. By tomorrow morning, the Apex building would belong to him. Tick. A faint metallic sound echoed from the ceiling. Bastian frowned, looking up at the heavy iron grating of the air vent. Rats. The place was full of them. Tick. Down on the floor, one of the guards stood up, looking toward the heavy steel double doors at the front. "Hey!" The guard yelled, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Who killed the perimeter lights?" Bastian walked to the glass. Outside, the harsh halogen glare was gone. The building was surrounded by a wall of absolute impenetrable blackness. A cold prickle of unease ran down Bastian's spine. "Get on the radio," he barked into the intercom connecting his office to the floor. "Check the cameras." A guard scrambled to a bank of monitors. He tapped the screen frantically. "Boss!" "They're dead. All the feeds are dead." Before Bastian could shout an order, a sound like a thunderclap echoed through the garage. It was the sound of the main breakers being violently severed. Every light in the building died simultaneously. The hum of the generators choked and sputtered into silence. The sudden darkness was absolute, heavy and suffocating. Panic erupted on the floor. Men shouted the sounds of chairs scraping and weapons being racked, filling the dark. Flashlight beams cut through the pitch-black, erratic and terrified, sweeping over concrete pillars and the slick hoods of cars. Click. The heavy magnetic lock on the front rolling door disengaged. The chain rattled. The door began to slowly, agonizingly roll upward, pushed by an unseen hand. A guard screamed. "Cover the door!" 10 flashlight beams converged on the entrance. The rain was falling in silver sheets against the pale light of the moon, and standing in the threshold, framed by the storm, was Damien Rousseau. He wasn't wearing a pristine suit. He was covered in mud and blood. He held a high-capacity pistol in his right hand. He didn't run for cover. He walked slowly, deliberately, into the crosshairs of 20 terrified men. "Kill him!" Bastian screamed from the balcony, his voice cracking with terror. The men raised their rifles, but from the deep shadows among the rafters, a nightmare descended. Hazel dropped behind the rear guard. She didn't use a gun. Muzzle flashes would give away her position. She was a phantom. She moved with a fluid, terrifying silence. A blade flashed in the dim ambient light, biting into the carotid artery of the nearest guard. He fell with a wet gasp. The guard next to him spun around his flashlight beam, swinging wildly. It caught nothing but empty air. Then a heavy steel pipe swung from the darkness, shattering his knee. As he dropped, a boot caught him under the chin, snapping his head back. "They're behind us!" someone shrieked. Gunfire erupted. But they weren't shooting at Damien. They were shooting at the shadows. They were shooting at each other. Crossfire tore through the garage. Bullets sparked against the concrete, illuminating the chaos in brief, strobe-like flashes of violence. In the flashes, Damien moved. He was the anchor, the visible threat that kept their attention divided. He fired, precisely taking down the men who managed to hold their nerve and aim at him. But the true slaughter was happening in the dark spaces between the flashes. Hazel was dismantling Bastian's empire piece by piece. She weaponized their fear. She threw a handful of loose ball bearings across the floor. A guard spun toward the noise, firing a wild burst, and accidentally tore through the chest of his own partner. She rigged a stray flashlight to roll under a car drawing fire while she slipped behind the shooters and snapped necks with clinical efficiency. It took exactly 3 minutes. When the shooting stopped, the only sounds left were the drumming of the rain and the ragged breathing of the dying. The garage floor was a slaughterhouse. Bastian Locke was frozen on the second-story balcony. His Scotch glass had shattered on the floor. He watched, trembling violently, as Damian Russo walked slowly up the metal stairs. Bastian drew his gun, his hand shaking so badly he could barely aim. "Stay back, Russo. Stay back." Damian didn't stop. He reached the top of the stairs and walked into Bastian's office. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to shift, separating from the darkness. Hazel stepped into the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Her chest was heaving slightly. Her hands were stained red. She held a suppressed pistol leveled directly at the back of Bastian's head. Bastian slowly lowered his weapon. He looked at Damian, then at the terrifying, blood-soaked woman standing behind him. "Who?" Bastian choked out a sob caught in his throat. "What is that?" Damian looked at Hazel. The ghost, the shield, the woman who had poured his coffee while holding the entire world at bay. He looked back at the trembling, broken man in front of him. "That," Damian said softly, raising his own gun, "is my secretary." He pulled the trigger. The sun rose over Chicago, a pale, anemic light struggling through the grey clouds. The 72nd floor of the Apex building was silent. Damian stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a glass of scotch. He had showered in his private suite. He wore fresh trousers and a clean, unbuttoned white shirt. A white bandage was taped over the shallow cut on his cheekbone. The door to his office clicked open. Damian didn't turn around immediately. He listened to the footsteps. They weren't silent anymore. They were deliberate, grounded. He turned. Hazel walked into the room. She wasn't wearing a beige cardigan. She wore a sharp, tailored black suit that fit her perfectly. Her hair fell loosely around her shoulders, framing a face that was clean of grease, though a dark bruise bloomed along her jawline. She looked entirely different. She looked lethal. She looked real. "Garrett is out of surgery," Hazel said, walking toward the desk. Her voice was still measured, still calm, but the flat, robotic affectation was gone. There was a current of warmth beneath it, a current of humanity. "The doctors say he'll keep the leg. He's asking for you." "I'll see him this afternoon," Damian said. He walked over to his heavy mahogany desk. He didn't sit behind it. He leaned against the front of it, crossing his arms. He watched her. Hazel stood in the center of the room. She looked at the empty spot in the bullpen beyond the glass walls. Her old desk. "Bastian's lieutenants are scrambling," Damian said quietly. "With him gone, the south side is fractured. They're terrified. The rumors are already spreading. They're saying I wiped out 20 men alone in the dark." "A useful narrative," Hazel noted. "Fear is a fragile shield, but it is a shield nonetheless. It will buy you time to restructure your security protocols." "My security protocols," Damian repeated. He set his scotch glass down on the wood. "I reviewed your file. The real one. The one Garrett couldn't find, but the one you left on my desk this morning." Hazel met his eyes. She didn't flinch. And, Damian said, pushing off the desk and taking a slow step toward her, "You are overqualified for an administrative position, Miss Brooks." A faint, genuine smile touched her lips. It changed her entire face, softening the harsh edges of her survival instincts. "I type 200 words a minute, Mr. Russo. I am highly efficient." "You are." Damian stopped a foot away from her. The air between them was crackling thick with a shared history written in secrets and blood. He looked at the bruise on her jaw. Gently, deliberately, he reached out. His knuckles brushed lightly against her uninjured cheek. Hazel didn't pull back. Her eyes fluttered shut for a fraction of a second, leaning a microscopic inch into his touch. It was an admission of vulnerability from a woman who had spent her entire life fortifying herself against it. "I don't want a ghost anymore," Damien said, his voice a low rumble. "I don't want a shield hiding in the shadows." Hazel opened her eyes. They were bright, reflecting the morning light. "What do you want, Damien?" It was the first time she had used his first name. It hit him harder than any physical blow ever could. "I want a partner," Damien said, his gaze locked entirely on hers. "I want the woman who patched my brakes and crippled my enemies to sit at the table with me, not behind a desk, beside me." Hazel looked at him for a long, quiet moment. The cynicism and the violence of their world washed against the glass windows of the high-rise, but inside the room there was only the gravity of two survivors, finally recognizing each other. She reached up her hand gently, wrapping around his wrist, her thumb resting over his racing pulse. "Partners share the risks," Hazel whispered softly, "and they share the rewards." "I know," Damien said, stepping into her space, the distance between them entirely gone. "I'm willing to sign the contract." Hazel smiled, a real devastating thing. "I'll draft the paperwork." Damien's empire almost fell, because he couldn't see the quiet strength right in front of him, but Hazel proved that the deadliest forces are often the ones you never hear coming. From invisible secretary to the undisputed queen of the Chicago underworld, their dynamic has shifted from a one-sided contract into a lethal, unbreakable partnership forged in blood and trust. If you loved the silent tension, the tactical takedowns, and the slow-burn romance between Damien and Hazel, hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another dark, high-stakes story.